Welcome back to Beyond the Uniform. I'm Justin Asiri, and each week I dive into data, interviews, and conversations intended to help active duty military personnel figure out what they want to do in their civilian career and how to get there. Today is episode number 135, and for this episode, we're going to be doing a deep dive into some data about the field of management consulting. For this episode, I looked at 4,300 LinkedIn profiles. This includes people who served in the United States Armed Forces and then worked at some time at one of the top 10 management consulting firms as defined by Forbes magazine. We're going to look at a tremendous amount of data, how long people serve in the military, how long they work as a civilian prior to consulting, how this affects which consulting firm they work at, and at what level. At the end of this, we're going to be getting into a lot of salary information. So I always want to provide a disclaimer at the start that there are so many factors that go into selecting a career. Location, fit, community, culture, opportunity for advancement, fulfillment, and work-life balance are just a few of those factors. And yes, salary is one of those factors. It is the simplest for me to quantify, so I think it's worth discussing. However, my intention in going through this data is simply to provide you, the veteran community, with more information so that you can make the unique decision that is right for you and for your family. So if you've not listened to the first episode in this series, I recommend you check that out. It's episode number 133. I dive into data specific to McKinsey and Company, the number one rated firm for management consulting. We look at the associate position and what people did to get there. It's not necessary that you listen to that prior to this, but it has other great data relevant to veterans interested in consulting. More importantly, if you have not yet pre-registered for the January 17th, 2018 online event, Veterans in Consulting, stop what you're doing right now. Pull over, get someone to relieve you as officer of the deck, go to Periscope Depth and get a satellite connection. Do whatever you have to, but go to beyondtheuniform.io, click on Events at the top, and Veterans in Consulting, and pre-register. That way you'll get notified as this event comes together. It will be a 75-minute video conference where I interview 3 different veterans who went directly from active duty to a top-tier consulting firm, specifically Boston Consulting Group, Bain and Company, and McKinsey and Company. I will be asking about how they got there, tips for interviewing, attire for your interview, what day-to-day life is like, what the career progression is like, what their free time is like, what their life is like, everything you could possibly want to know about a career in management consulting, and probably 1 to 2 things you don't want to know about it. Additionally, I'm going to open it up to the group. We'll do a live Q&A session. You do not want to miss out on it, so pre-register today. This will be a paid event, something between $10 to $15, depending on if I find a sponsor. The reason I'm charging for this is because, first of all, there is a large body of research showing that people value more that which they pay for. And second of all, it does help offset the cost of the Beyond the Uniform podcast show. This is a side project for me, and I've managed to rack up quite a bit of expenses in bringing this to life. So I want to continue to do this and offer this podcast and data for free to everyone, but having a paid component really helps me do so. So with that, let's dive into some of this data. In terms of an agenda, here's what we're looking at today. First of all, we're going to start by looking at the firms, the total number of the top 10, looking at the number of veterans that work there. Second, we'll break down by branch of service, what that indicates about where veterans end up. Third, we will look at time in service, how one's length of military service impacts where they go. Fourth, we will look at the amount of civilian work experience a veteran accumulates prior to going to consulting and how that impacts where they end up. Then we'll look at titles, which titles veterans tend to gravitate towards at each specific firm. And I'll also look at some salary data that goes along with that. Lots and lots of salary data. If you're interested in how I assemble this data, post it in the show notes. Posted in the show notes are kind of the methodology I used. I don't want to bore you. It doesn't translate well for an audio format, but special thanks to Mechanical Turk, an Amazon company, people who do these tasks for 5 cents a task. They helped me assemble and analyze this data, 4,300 profiles to be specific. It took a tremendous amount of time. They saved me hundreds of hours. They also cost me hundreds of dollars, but it's very likely that money would have gone to Lark Burger, which is a delicious Denver-based burger joint. Though it's not nutritious, their burgers, fries, and shakes are incredible. So perhaps beyond the uniform, you have extended my life by taking that money I would have wasted on Lark Burger and poured it into Mechanical Turk as well. So my lean figure and healthy mental state I have to owe to you listeners. So let's start by looking at the firms and where veterans tend to end up. To do this, I'm going to be using that Forbes list that I referenced in the first McKinsey data interview. I look at a list of the top 10 management consulting companies as defined by Forbes. The number one firm is McKinsey & Company. That's where 2% of veterans go into management consulting. The number 2 was Boston Consulting Group, or BCG. Only 1.2% of veterans are able to get in the door there. Bain & Company is number 3, where just above 0.5% of veterans end up. This was the lowest number of veterans of any of the top 10 firms were at Bain & Company. Number 4 is Deloitte. Deloitte Consulting. There is quite a few veterans there. 12.2% of all veterans in management consulting end up in Deloitte, but that is nothing. It's just a drop in the bucket compared to the number 5 firm. Smack dab in the middle is Booz Allen Hamilton. They took the lion's share of all the veterans in consulting, with 42% of veterans who are working in consulting working at Booz Allen and Hamilton. Number 6 is Price Waterhouse Cooper, or PwC, which has about 6% of veterans. 7 was Ernst & Young, also with 6%. Accenture had 10%. KPMG was number 9 with only 1.5%. And last but certainly not least was IBM, which was the second highest employer with 18% of all of veterans who are in the management consulting industry. What do you take away from this? Well, less than 4% of all veterans go into management consulting in a top 3 firm. I will be doing a follow-up data episode that looks at the characteristics of these top 3 firms and what you can learn if you aspire to go there. If that's your aspiration, it is worthwhile to aspire those who went there. That was my intention for part 1, where we looked at McKinsey & Company. Based on feedback, I'm going to be broadening that to look at the top 3 firms. If you're playing the odds, I would be sure to add more popular firms in your application process. So if you are dropping applications at the top 3, I personally would include an application to Deloitte, to Booz Allen Hamilton, to Accenture, and to IBM. They're all great firms, and they have a very large veteran population. Not only does this mean statistically that you have a better chance of working there, but it also means there's a wealth of knowledge. There are so many veterans at these institutions that you can reach out to. They can help you understand what it's like to work there and how you might get your foot in the door. Next up, let's look at branch of service. So of the 4,000 plus veteran profiles I looked at on LinkedIn who work in management consulting, let's look at where they came from. Most of them, 39%, are coming from the Army. This is followed by the Air Force, which was 31% of the population, followed by my team, Team Navy, which was 28% of the population, and then Coast Guard and Marine Corps with 2% and 1% respectively. Don't read too much into this. Coast Guard and Marine Corps are so much smaller than those other three branches in terms of population, so it's not surprising that their representative numbers in the industry of management consulting would be smaller. I did find it interesting amongst these branches to see where each branch spiked in the population of a firm. So I drilled down, and so at McKinsey and Company, the Navy is actually the largest population. It was 44% versus the Army's 40%. So take that, Army. That was the only deviation that really stood out for the most part. Army's the largest population at different consulting firms. Of note, it's pretty equal distribution at IBM, where it's pretty much 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 for Army, Navy, and Air Force. Bain, 51% is Army. It's pretty lopsided there. And BCG and McKinsey had Army and Navy pretty comparable, just about 5% apart. But Air Force represented to a lesser extent at Bain and BCG. It was 18% and 15% respectively. Next, let's take a look at the length of military service and how long you serve in the military, how that affects your career in management consulting. So Army leads the charge in terms of numbers in consulting, but it's at the bottom of the ladder when it comes to length of military service. The average Army veteran serves for 7.1 years. That was the lowest number of service prior to going into consulting. Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard were pretty comparable, with 10 years for Navy, 10.3 for Air Force, and 10.5 years for Coast Guard. And Marines are inspiring me with their patriotism. They serve for an average of 12.3 years prior to going on to a career in management consulting. I do think it would be very interesting to look at how the length of one's service correlates to a starting title and a starting salary at each company. For that, I would need a lot more mechanical Turkers and more money. So for now, that one will remain a mystery, but maybe one day we'll drill down into that level of detail. I also looked at how the length of one's military service affects which management consulting firm the veteran goes into. So again, using that the Forbes ranking of the top 10 firms, let's look at the numbers. So I'm just going to go 1 through 10 again. Starting with number 1 at McKinsey, the average veteran served for 6.7 years. This was the third shortest length of service. The number 2 was Boston Consulting Group, or BCG. This was the second lowest length of military service, an average of just 6.4 years. And number 3 was Bain, which had the lowest length of military service, or 5.8 years of service prior to going to Bain. One can theorize as to why this is. It's just a theory. It's clear to me that veterans working at a top 3 management consulting firm get out of the military earlier than those who did not. I have some hypotheses around this. One is that from my McKinsey research, it's clear that an MBA is the most efficient route to a role at one of these top 3 companies. So I'm guessing that it's easier to do this earlier in one's life, where the opportunity cost is lower to go to business school. And I'm guessing it's more difficult to do it later in one's life, after one has become accustomed to a higher salary in the military, one has accumulated more personal life obligations, and is less able to forgo a salary for 2 years than it might have been earlier in their life. Again, that's just a theory. Continuing down the list, number 4, Deloitte. 8.1 years of service was the average. This was actually the third highest length of service. Number 5, Booz Allen Hamilton. This had the longest duration of military service, 12.8 years on average. So it seems like Booz Allen tends to attract those who have served longer in the military. PwC, or PricewaterhouseCoopers, was number 6 on the list, and the average service length there was 7.5 years. Ernst & Young was 6.8 years, Accenture was 8.1 years, KPMG was 6 years, pretty low, and IBM at number 10 was the 8.5 8.4 years of service, which places them as the second longest length of military service next to Booz Allen Hamilton. What to take from this, I'm not quite sure. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section of the show notes. Would love to have greater minds than my own take a crack at this. The only theory I really jumped out to me was the top 3 firms, but hopefully those numbers are somewhat clarifying for you. Hopefully they add some value or give you some knowledge that you can put into use as you think of your own career. The next thing that I did is I looked at how much civilian work experience a veteran had prior to working in management consulting. Again, first we'll start by branch of service, then we'll switch over to specific firms. So Marines had the least amount of civilian work experience prior to going to management consulting, just 3.3 years on average. You'll remember that Marines also had the longest length of military service, so maybe that accounts for it. The U.S. Army had the most civilian work experience prior to consulting time, about 6.6 years of civilian work experience on average. And again, they had the lowest length of military service, so I think those two kind of go hand in hand. In between was the Coast Guard with just 3.9 years of civilian work experience. The Air Force had 5.3 years of civilian work experience, and the Navy had 7.1 years of civilian work experience on average. This made me think, what is the total amount of experience that someone had prior to going to management consulting between military and civilian experience? So, because I love you all so much, I cut the data a separate way. I looked at the combined amount of experience, both military and civilian, someone had prior to going into management consulting. The Army had the least amount of combined experience pre-consulting, 13.7 years. The Coast Guard was closely behind that with 14.4 years. The Air Force had 15.6 years. The Marine Corps was about the same, 15.7. And the Navy bringing up the rear with a whopping 17.1 years of combined experience before going into consulting. I then broke this down by civilian work experience based on consulting firm. I found the results were pretty comparable to the years of military experience. I'll just kind of blow through this. The top 3 firms had the lowest amount of service, specifically, the lowest amount of the lowest amount of civilian work experience. Specifically, McKinsey, BCG, and Bain had 2.1, 2.2, and 1.3 years of experience respectively, which coincidentally is highly correlated to the length of time it takes to obtain an MBA. Listen to the next episode if you want to delve into that more. We'll look at the top 3 firms and characteristics specifically there. Deloitte averaged 7.2 years. Booz Allen was surprising, just 2.7 years of work experience. You'll recall that Booz Allen had the longest length of military service at 12.7 years. So I would guess that people spend more time on active duty prior to working at Booz Allen Hamilton, but more often than not go directly from the military to work there. Just a guess. PricewaterhouseCoopers was 4.8 years of civilian work experience. Ernst & Young, 7.1. Accenture and KPMG were 7.5 and 7.9 years respectively, and IBM was the longest with 11.1 years of civilian work experience. My main takeaways from this were the velocity with which people enter into a top 3 firm, just that short 1 to 2 years, and how it seems like it's easier to make a direct transition to Booz Allen Hamilton than other firms coming from the military. But again, let me know your thoughts and questions in the comment sections of the show notes, and I can dig into this more. One last thing I wanted to do with this, just as we did with the branch of service, is take a crack at the combined experience, both military and civilian, for each firm. So looking at the shortest amount of combined experience, that's military and civilian by firm, the lowest with just 7.1 years of combined experience on average was Bain & Company. Silver medal goes to BCG or Boston Consulting Group with 8.6, and bronze goes to McKinsey at 8.9 years of service. This is consistent with my hypothesis that the average candidate at these top 3 firms gets out earlier and goes to graduate school, and again, it's just a theory. The next subset with 4th, 5th, and 6th place was PricewaterhouseCoopers with 12.3 years, Ernst & Young's with 13.9 years, and KPMG with 14.3 years of combined average experience. Deloitte had 15.4 years, Booz Allen had 15.5, Accenture had 15.6, and finally IBM came in with the most experience of nearly 20 years of combined experience. How are we doing? I know this is a lot of numbers to go through by audio. Before we dive into the final category, I would love to hear your feedback on this sort of episode. It's kind of new for me to do this. If it's helpful, I'll try to do more of this. I'll try to tear into the data on different careers and salary information. If it's more helpful to have this in an ebook form or a form where you can see it visually, I can set aside time to do that. And if there's ways to tweak this to make it more usable, please let me know. I really look to your feedback to know whether to do more of this. So the last thing I looked at is probably the most helpful. I took a look at titles, the most common titles for veterans at a top 10 firm. And then I looked at their corresponding salaries at Glassdoor.com. There is so much information here. There is no limit to how deep we could go on this. So you can look in the show notes for more details here. But just a quick caveat on the salaries. I looked at total compensation, not just base. If you look at Glassdoor, they provide you with the base, which is what you're guaranteed, and then the total compensation, which includes performance incentives like bonuses. I also, just to make this uniform, I used San Francisco as the office that I researched to try and keep it consistent against all of these different firms. Those salaries will obviously vary by location, but this should provide a basic benchmark of salaries and how they compare to each other. There are so many ways to slice and dice this data. I will do more based on your feedback, but here is what I did. So I looked at the most common titles for military veterans at each of the top 10 consulting firms. I then cross-referenced this with salary information that's available at Glassdoor.com. Then I ranked each firm by salary, highest to lowest. Take all of this with a grain of salt. There's so many factors that go into this, but here's what I found. The highest salary actually went to Accenture. The most common title there for a veteran is senior manager, which has a salary of $207,000 per year. That was surprising to me. I actually expected what I found next, which was that McKinsey, BCG, and Bain, they all have comparable titles and salaries, the salary being $180,000 a year. The corresponding title was associate at McKinsey and Company and consultant at both BCG and Bain. If you're curious to learn more, keep your eyes out for the next data episode. We're going to drill into those top 3 in a lot more detail. Next was IBM, where the title was managing consultant and a salary of $144,000 per year. Then was Booz Allen Hamilton. The most common title there is associate with a salary of $132,000 per year. Deloitte was next with the most common title of senior consultant and a corresponding salary of $127,000 per year. PwC was 8th, where the most common title is senior associate for a veteran, and the salary corresponding to that is $104,000 per year. Ernst & Young was 9th. The most common title there for veterans is senior consultant with $102,000 per year. And the last was KPMG, where the most common title for a veteran is senior associate, and the salary there is $91,000 per year. One final way to look at this data is by looking at those combined years of experience, both military and civilian, and seeing how much money and salary you get per year of experience. Does that make sense? Basically just saying, hey, like for every year of experience, how much money do you get per year? Seen in this light, the best deal is Bain, with the highest of $24,000 per year of experience that you have. With BCG and McKinsey both providing about $20,500 per year of experience, and Accenture at number 4 providing $13,000 per year of experience. You can view the full breakdown of that in the show notes. Your troopers, if you have stuck around this long, I would really, really, really appreciate feedback on if this is valuable to you. You can email me at justin@beyondtheuniform.io. You can fill out the contact form on the website. You can leave a comment in the show notes. Any of those 3 ways is a convenient way to get to me. I will do more of these if I hear from you. I will do less of them if I don't. That's not a threat. It's just it seems like the interviews are a great format, and I'm not quite sure if this is a great way to use our time together on the air. I will be back regardless with one more episode, diving into a lot more numbers on those top 3 firms. Keep an eye out for that. Sign up for Veterans in Consulting. Sign up, pre-register today. You do not want to miss this. I guarantee you for 75 minutes of your time, you will get at least $100 worth of value out of this. Absolutely guarantee it. It is going to be extremely compelling. Hear from 3 vets who did not go to business school, who did not they are part of the 5% of veterans who go directly to a top-tier consulting firm. It is very rare to see this, 1 out of 20, and I got 3 of them for that panel. You won't want to miss it. Pre-register online. And lastly, if you haven't already, I'm talking to you, freeloaders. I'm just joking, but only kind of. If you have not yet left a review on iTunes, please do so. It does make a massive difference in my pride, ego, and more importantly, getting the word out to more veterans who can benefit from this show. I'm just realizing maybe you are super crafty. Maybe you think that other veterans are your competition. And if you keep Beyond the Uniform to yourself, that will be your competitive edge. Not bad thinking, but bad for your karma. So please leave a review, get it out to more veterans, and I'm sure you will do well, even with the competitive landscape of other stellar veterans going for similar jobs. Have a great week. I look forward to hearing from you with your feedback on the show, and I will be back with the more traditional format of interviews with veterans soon. Take care.